Teck Resources is walking away from its proposed $20 billion oil sands mine. It's another major hit to an industry and a province that need a shot in the arm. And the CEO of Teck Resources is blaming the political debate around climate change. The Trudeau cabinet was expected to announce its decision this week on whether Teck's Frontier mine could go ahead. The proposed mine was set for north of Fort McMurray, expected to create thousands of jobs. It had already passed a long regulatory review and had the support of area First Nations. But it faced strong opposition from environmental groups and from within the Liberal caucus itself. Some reaction. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney laying the blame for Teck's decision directly at the feet of the Trudeau government. In his statement, Kenney referenced the ongoing Indigenous blockade, saying it is what happens when governments lack the courage to defend the interests of Canadians in the face of a militant minority. The timing of the decision is not a coincidence. The Prime Minister's office issued its own statement saying Justin Trudeau spoke with Premier Kenney after the news broke. It says in part both the Prime Minister and the Premier agreed on the importance of Canada's natural resource sector to our economy. They discussed their commitment to developing our natural resources sustainably and creating jobs. All of which sets up this conversation with our national affairs editor, Chris Hall, who is in Ottawa with more on this. Chris, I'm so glad to have you today. To begin by helping us understand the import of this decision from Teck.
It's a huge decision on the economic and the political front. Economically, of course, there were thousands of jobs in construction and permanent jobs once this mine was operating. There were billions of dollars in revenue, upwards to 70 potentially, over the course of the lifetime of this oil sands project if it went ahead. So clearly that's important. The decision not to proceed, you read a bit of the letter from Don Lindsay, the CEO of Teck, is a lot about the economic environment. Clearly there's some concern about whether the resource development can continue in this country without some kind of an agreement around climate change at the various levels of government and across regions. But also, look, this was a big project, and when it was first proposed, there was a suggestion that it would need about $90 a barrel of bitumen to be able to be profitable. Clearly, prices of oil are much less than that now. So on the economic front, that's the part of it. The politics, obviously, Jason Kenney has pushed very, very hard for this project, has wrapped a positive decision around the fact that this would help deal with the sense of alienation that Albertans feel from the federal government, from the rest of the country. He warned about the potential for separation to grow as a movement if it was rejected. Well, now there is no decision that has to be made by the federal government. So at least for the short term politically, that is a relief, I know, here in Ottawa. But the longer term strategy is to how do you work out these differences? How do you actually get policies in place, both Alberta policies, Saskatchewan policies, and federal governments that recognizes that there has to be a price on carbon and there has to be a way forward to meet that target that Canada has met of net zero emissions by 2050.
And the letter, as you say, from Don Lindsay, very clear that that does not yet exist in the region. The region has yet to achieve, Alberta or Canada, whatever he's referencing, it is not in place. You've raised so many things. Let's look at some of them in a little bit more detail. Continue on with Jason Kenney, if you will, because Vashi was reporting this morning and last night, Chris, that he was very angry over this, as you might expect. And part of his statement in response reads this way: it is what happens when governments lack the courage to defend the interests of Canadians in the face of a militant minority. It talks about how that's not a coincidence, the timing of this. Does this have anything to do with the rail blockades we're seeing?
I don't think directly. I think Teck was, I know, for example, that the board was meeting all last week trying to plan what its response would be and how to move forward with this. Jason Kenney, obviously, a lot was deriding, a lot depending in terms of the economic development of the province in the future on this project going ahead. When you ask about the Wet'suwet'en and the dispute over the Coastal GasLink, there are two very different projects. I would point out that, at least in the case of Teck, that they were held out as one of the best examples of Indigenous consultations about involving and signing agreements that would be beneficial to people who lived in and around that development. The converse of that is that it was going to have a significant adverse environmental impact. That's what the review said, even though it said it could go ahead in the national interest. So I think it's a very different case. The timing isn't great, but I'm not sure there's a direct link there.
Okay, but you raised a really interesting question. I mean, if you look at all of the research projects which have met their demise, and now this one, despite meeting all of the assessment criteria, despite getting Indigenous approval, even those things, not enough in the country now, Chris.
Yeah, that's the bigger question, isn't it? There are some oil sands projects that have been approved, but the question now is, what kind of investment climate does Canada represent in the natural resource sector? There are a lot of people, Jason Kenney among them, Perrin Beatty from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, who worry that Canada, it doesn't seem to be a great place to invest. From the federal government side, look, I know that Seamus O'Regan, the Natural Resources Minister, may be going as early as today to Alberta to speak to investors, to the industry, to talk about a way forward, to talk about trying to mirror or manage the environmental impacts with the fact that there is an opportunity here to become more sustainable in the development of natural resources. That, I'm not sure, is going to assuage anybody's concerns here. But the broader message I think that most people are worried about is what happens in the days and weeks ahead with a reputational hit that Canada may take if a company like Teck, which has done, as I said earlier, almost everything right, which is seen as a very progressive company when it came to the Indigenous issues, and has its own, as a company, net zero emissions policy for 2050. If it can't get approval or doesn't feel it can go ahead with a project, I understand the economics are a little bit risky right now, but if it can't find partners to go ahead with a project like this, then who can?
We may hear more of the larger issue picture when Don Lindsay speaks in Florida. He just, as it would happen, is speaking at a conference for the metal industry, mining industry in Florida this morning, which we'll be listening to even more closely than we might have otherwise. One of the things that Jason Kenney invoked in his statement, Chris, right away, he went to the national unity picture, mentioned that directly. What are the repercussions here for federal-provincial relations?
Yeah, I think that's where we now have to sort of look as the response from the federal government comes in. You know, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, is in charge of that file. I don't think she's going to Alberta right away, but clearly she will be tasked with trying to discuss how you work through these kinds of issues, how we make the transition as a country into more sustainable development. I'm not sure what kind of reception Alberta will give to that, but that's clearly one of the issues they want to discuss. The alienation question is real. We talked about it on the weekend on the House, the concerns that people have in Alberta that in the east and central Canada, the federal government not really being in tune with some of the issues and the problems being faced in Alberta. Chrystia Freeland, of course, hails from that province, has family still there. She will be, I'm sure, we'll be hearing from her as this unfolds about what might be done and how they can work together. But that is a serious concern for the federal government, already grappling with the Wet'suwet'en, with the blockades that are now into their third week along the very busy rail corridor between Toronto and Montreal. This is just another headache for the government to see how they can work this through and get things on a more even keel right now.
Chris, thank you very much. Really appreciate having you there to situate this how we understand it nationally. Our national affairs editor, the host of The House on CBC Radio, Chris Hall.